Hi there, yes, I'm from Curtin University, and I just wanted to acknowledge elders past and present, and also the depth of knowledge that is in this room. I've been in vegetation science for about 4 years now, so there's a lot of people here. It's quite humbling to hear them speak, and just wanted to recognise that. So as an overview, I'm just going to do a quick recap of vegetation classification, some recent developments in the sort of big data space, software tools for data processing, and a case study. As part of my PhD, I've been working with a data set from Alcoa, quite a large data set, 30,000 plots, so I'll talk about that, and then going forward in this space. So the bottom line, I guess, of vegetation classification is making sense of the tangled mass of green. Kelly mentioned this morning, phytosociology is the science of recognising and defining different plant communities. So we're integrating species variation into recognisable units. These are often also indicators of abiotic conditions, but it's important to remember that it's an abstraction. Like some communities, obviously, definitely very obvious. You go out, you can see them. Others, it's a little bit more in the messy middle. Ooh, so a bit of history. I think Humboldt in the 1800s is the first official vegetation classification in South America. The early 1900s sort of saw the structural way of describing vegetation come about, and then Braun Blanquet was the floristic. We have these ideas about vegetation from Clements, and that veg is a sort of superorganism, and things are, they're all really related and depend on each other. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got Gleason sort of saying all plants have an individual response to the environment. They're not really affecting each other. And then through the 80s and 90s, we've had a lot of literature. It's still really big in ecology, with the problem of scale, and things kind of look different whether you zoom in or out and how you deal with that. And then also connected to that is the two main schools of thought: the European, that vegetation is discrete, sort of up in the top here, you can get really nice distinct communities, and then that it's continuous. And we kind of recognise now that patterns going to fall somewhere in between those two extremes mostly. And then I guess in the last decade or so, what's really kicked in is the computing and big data era. So a lot of, I've been working with a lot of Hubble's work. That was in the mid-70s, and he was doing things on punch cards that it's a supercomputer at UWA compared to kind of what we can do now. So big data is a bit of an ambiguous name, like as Chris mentioned, like what he's doing at WAPSI is not big data. Other people would call that big data. Some examples in veg science are the European Vegetation Archive. They've got 1 million plots. There's a global index vegetation plot database, which is sitting at about 3 million. As part of TERN, the Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network in Australia, they've got 22,000 plots. Not to compare, New Zealand has 94,000, and I think 21,000 of those are permanent plots that they go back and revisit. So this is pretty powerful data sources. A lot of them come from online archiving and data sharing. So it's not just one organisation that's put these together, it's come about through collaborations. In Australia, so you obviously need the power and tools to start to work with this data. NCRAS has funded a lot of research infrastructure, including TERN, Horsey, which is our supercomputing node in WA, the Atlas of Living Australia. I think there's been nearly $60 million has been spent on that to date, so it's a really powerful platform. And things like BCCVL, which is the Biodiversity and Climate Change Virtual Laboratory. And I'm just going to give this a little plug. I learned about this in the first year of my PhD, and it's amazing. Like, I know species distribution modelling is a pretty controversial area, and it really does depend on the quality of the data that you're putting into those models as to how good they are. But this is an online, it's a website, you can go there, Google it. It's a really great place to go if you want to just learn about species distribution modelling. They've made it really easy. It also houses a lot of data, so I just was really impressed at what they've done there to make things easier. So eco-informatics and more in general, some tools we've got. JUICE is Eastern Europeans developed software for analysing data. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of R, it's open source free software for statistical analysis. And this whole big machine of machine learning, there's really great tools now which actually can make this pretty accessible with a bit of learning. So kind of the point for all of that though is we're not really limited by computing power or analysis tools now. So it does come back to the quality of data and the availability of data and whether it's fit for purpose. So my work is with Alcoa's vegetation data. This is their pre-mine survey data. Alcoa's been mining in the Jarrah Forest for a long time, since the early 60s. They've been doing veg surveys since the early 90s and they're still ongoing. They also do rare flora, mapping of community types, and these species lists they use to help define their good mixes for restoration. So the tenement pretty much covers the northern Jarrah Forest. If you're not familiar with the northern Jarrah Forest, it's in southwest Western Australia. It has about 3,000 species and 140 families. I was surprised by that. I live up in the hills and I didn't know that it had that many species in it, I guess, in comparison to some other areas. It's a Mediterranean climate, subdued topography, and disturbance is really important in this system. Obviously fire, the whole thing's been logged twice pretty much, and then mining. And we're seeing really strong drying in the forest now, up to 100% drop in stream flow, and around 15 to 20% drop in rainfall since pre-1970. So the survey plots are on a 120 metre grid following ore exploration, 20 metre for trees, 5 metres for shrubs. We've got about 500 species in the data set that's cleaned. There are about 800 in total. And nearly 90 botanists have been involved with collecting this data set. So the first job was just to try and get a bit of a handle on it. It's like, what do you do with that data? Sure, you've got a lot of data, but what's your first step? So we thought we need to give the data set a bit of context in terms of the northern Jarrah Forest. So of the 140 or so families in the forest, we've got about half of them. And a quarter of the data set is in Proteaceae and Phalaceae. In terms of the geographic context, with the vegetation complexes that were mapped by Hedel in the 80s, we've got 11 of the 41 complexes for the northern Jarrah Forest. Dwelling up complex 1 is about nearly half of those, and about just 5 of those complexes cover most of the data set. So it's a really well-structured data set. We've got a lot of data points, but it's not representative of the northern Jarrah Forest, and that instantly limits what you can do with it. So my first step is to cluster the data set. We want to just look at the pattern in it, and lots of times that is called exploratory analysis. That's your first step when you're working with the data set. You just want to understand it a bit better. And there's a lot of different methods, options for vegetation classification for doing this. So it can be a bit of a black hole. Sort of like that was my soul going down the black hole as I try to get across this. You've got a lot of different choices of software options, dissimilarity measures, and then clustering algorithms and different variations. So I'm going to go through this a little bit, but hopefully not in a too bad a way. So we looked at R. I had heard R is great for big data. You can do reproducible code, which they love in science. You can publish it, someone else can look at it, check it, do the same thing if they want to. And there's a really big international community behind R, which makes the quality of the packages available really good, and it's free. And the downside was it can take a long time to learn how to use it. And the other option I looked at was pattern. You didn't have to learn R, it's got a nice user interface, so it's a bit easier to get to grips with. You don't have as much flexibility in what you can do, obviously. There's less help available. R is actually one of the strengths of R is that international community, and there's so much online help for figuring things out. And I wasn't sure about how big a data sets pattern could handle. This is at the start. So this is just an overview of the methods we sort of tested out on the data set to try and figure out which one would be best for clustering the data. I'm not going to go into the depths of that. The main distinction is hierarchical versus non-hierarchical clustering methods. So hierarchical ones give you those dendrogram trees. You can look at how sites or species group together, and you can choose where you're going to cut your tree as to how you want things grouped. Non-hierarchical, you don't have that option as much. So you can't really see this, and that's partly the point. When you put 30,000 plots into some of these analysis methods, you can't see anything. I spent ages trying to figure out how to visualize it, to no end really. This type of method called MONA splits plots by a single species, which is actually means it's quite fast computationally, but it's not ideal because obviously if you've got all your plots and one's all got Banksia grandis in this case and all the others don't, it might not actually tell you a lot about the ecology of the environment. In this case, Diana, you get a hierarchical tree to look at. It clusters based on your plots, so it's a bit more ecologically meaningful, but it just starts to turn into a mess, so I was like, okay. And the same thing for your other types of tree methods. So I've got one diagram which I couldn't figure out how to load, but it's pretty much, it's on an SVG file, so you can scroll across it. It'd be like the length of a football field if you put all the plots on it. So it's kind of like getting to that thing of statistics is supposed to help clarify things, like these aren't really working for that. And no matter what way you do it, there's always going to be issues with visualizing it. So you come to these non-hierarchical methods, and these aren't used, these clustering algorithms, just in ecology, they're kind of general statistical tools. They can be really fast. The problem in ecology a lot of the time is that you have to define a number of groups. With trees, it's good, you can see, and you can kind of pick what makes sense ecologically. You don't have that option with these ones. And a deal breaker really for K-means is that it's not appropriate for raw species abundance data with lots of zeros. So that puts out a lot of ecology data if you're just looking at present sentence. So after all of this, I kind of came back to the beginning and discovered that alloc and pattern, their non-hierarchical thing, is the best thing since sliced bread for me after all the pain of trying to figure it out. So really fast, take 10 minutes to run 30,000 plots. It's non-hierarchical, but Lee Belbin, who developed it, I know he's come over here and promoted it when he first did it. You can still visualize it with a dendrogram. You can do a dendrogram of the groups. So it's a little bit different than doing a dendrogram of your plots. And you can do an ordination, so it gives you some great ways to get to understand your data when you're at that exploratory step. And of course you can map it spatially if you've got coordinates. So I really liked that option. The downsides of it is less control. You can't really get behind the scenes unless you want to learn how to code in DOS, and I wasn't really up for that. And you have to buy it, but I think it's like $300 or something. So my lessons learned, for larger data sets, alloc and pattern is an excellent clustering tool. I think unless you're really, really into clustering and statistics, that's an easy go-to. And R is actually not ideal with big data. And there's great literature out there to support that, because the data has to be stored in physical memory, so it's not actually appropriate for large data sets. And I sort of came full circle back to the thing that clarifying your question is important too. Even when you just do an exploratory analysis, you kind of want to have an idea of what it is you're trying to do. And I thought this is great. You probably can't see it on this slide, but I emailed the guy that developed JUICE. He's an Eastern European vegetation scientist. He's quite famous. He's got like nearly 2,000 citations for this JUICE software, and I was like, I'm more titchy. I'm like, I've got 30,000 plots. I've got this big data set. Will JUICE be able to handle it? And he's like, well, I've got 3 million plots in it at the moment. Just make sure you change this setting before you start, and you should be fine. I was like, okay. So we have the capacity for these really, really big analyses. And obviously, I've been in the science side of things. I'm not really across the industry and botany on the ground side of things, but talking about cumulative impacts and stuff like that yesterday, I thought the capacity for these big analyses, I can see it fitting in that space to be able to put the stuff together. And it really comes down to what questions do we want to ask. what do we need to know, and then building an analysis that meets those questions. So going forward, I'm actually going over to IVIS, the International Vegetation Society's meeting up in Montana next month. They're looking at things like this. So Chichi's developed in his group semi-supervised classification, which enables you to take vegetation units that have already been created, like they're doing this for the Flora of Europe. So obviously, you know, a massive amount of work's already gone into classifying vegetation in certain areas. They don't want to just throw that all out and start again. So they're trying to work out how they can work with those units, but build more data in as it becomes available, as more data is collected, to improve those groups without starting from scratch. And then this whole thing of having more data and being able to do different kinds of analyses, not stuck with really small things because computers couldn't handle it. It's sort of, they've got a working group that's talking about rethinking biomes and stuff like that. So I think it'll be interesting conceptually as well, what's going to happen. So that's me. I roasted a little, but I just wanted to acknowledge scholarship through at the APA, Alcoa of Australia, and the ADA also botanists that collected data. I wasn't one of them, which I'm really jealous about. I wish I'd been out there, but yeah.
Some of us are in here.
Yeah, a lot of people probably were involved collecting that. So yeah, thank you.
Questions?
That's right. What were you finding? What were you finding when you did the analysis on the 30,000? What did you see your findings?
Sorry, the question was, what were my findings? So that's so the way we've done it, because it's like endless things that you could do with that data. So we've used it to do some modelling, which is not classification, around climate change and looking at the riparian communities in the data set and how they're going to contract with Cyrus predictions for drying. And that's what I'm going to IVIS to talk about. And the other thing I want to do that I haven't finished yet, which is why I couldn't show it here, is compare Hubble's groups and the indicator species in those types to the kind of indicator species that will pull out when you've got this many plots. Because Hubble's types are based on a 300 plot survey, but it was quite representative, like it was done across pretty much the whole northern Jarrah forest. So it'll be interesting to see if that comes out as different.
Hello, Grace again. When you're looking at the data, you're looking at presence and absence data, or cover values, or anything like that?
Yeah, for this clustering we just use presence absence. There is cover in the data set as well, but we decided not to use it for this.
Yeah, thank you for that. It was a very interesting presentation, particularly talking through, I guess, the thought process and decision process that you used along the way. It's quite interesting. So where are you at with respect to developing your results? You just mentioned that you're looking to compare between Havel's data, which was about 300 sites, I think you said, with the 30,000 sites that you've got from Alcoa.
Yeah, so basically it's like running some confusion matrix type stuff to look at the indicator species. We don't actually have Havel's raw data, which is a real pity, but we've got the indicator species for the Hubble types. So most of my time in the last 12 months has actually been doing the sort of predictive climate change modelling in that system to see how it's going to respond to drying.
No more questions? Okay, let's thank Sarah one last time.